Somebody asked me during one of the breaks earlier, said, how do you figure out how much drip tape do I need? That, and this is in your packet, so it's pretty easy. So 1 square acre is 43,560 square feet. You divide that by whatever your row spacing is. If it's 5 foot centers, so you need 8,712 linear feet of plastic or mulch for the acre. So it's pretty solid. Then it's a solid acre, obviously. Most times in a field, you're probably planting breaks and things like that, and roadways and such. But it's a simple math kind of thing. So you ready to go into farming full time? It's tough. So I have great admiration for farmers. It is not an easy job. So it's not, but it's exciting. I mean, there's so many really cool potentials of doing things. So especially even in urban areas. So we have so many more urban gardens now and urban farms. So vertical farms. So are there any vertical farms in St. Louis yet? You know, hydroponic farms, vertical, like for integrated for like lettuce. So you're in a major shipping point where all these highways come together. I mean, there's a lot of movement that could be done. Lettuce is not a bad one to grow. So not tomatoes, obviously, but some small scale places. Yeah, it's got, I think things like that have a lot of potential, frankly. So. Anybody have any questions from this morning? Anything I said? Do you remember anything I said this morning? So. The other question someone asked me, they said, how do you figure out how much water? This is sort of the final slide, which I can show you now, wait for the others to come in, but I'd said before, you really need to know how good your water source is. How much water comes in, how many gallons per minute or gallons per hour. That is key because that's going to dictate how much area you can actually irrigate at any given time. Drip tapes are always rated putting out so many gallons per minute per 100 feet. I do not know why they use that unit, but all the drip tapes will be labeled the same way. It'll say this tape puts out 0.4 or 0.17 gallons per minute per 100 feet of tape. So this is just some very quick math that you can use to figure out how much water you actually need to irrigate an acre. So there's high flow tapes, which are usually 0.4 or higher or someplace in that. There's medium flow tapes, which are 0.2, 0.3 of a gallon per minute. And then low flow tapes, which might be 0.15. So basically with a standard high flow tape, almost any place you go to buy drip tape, this is almost always what they've got. Something with 12-inch emitter spacings, this high flow. So basically, if you figure out from this little math, so 0.14 gallons per minute divided by 100, what you need to do is figure out the gallons per minute, how many gallons per minute this tape actually needs. You take that piece of information and you multiply it by how many linear feet you've got in an acre, in a solid acre. So 0.004 gallons per minute per feet times 7260. So if you have a 6 foot spacing between rows, that means I need 29.0 gallons per minute per acre for that tape to fully function. So that's the magic number. So, you know, if I have closer spacing, I need more water. Even closer spacing, I need even more water than that. So this is the ultimate number that's going to tell you how much area you can ever irrigate at any given time. So the nice thing is, though, with drip tape, you can, they make low flow tapes. So if you're only putting out 0.17 gallons per minute, you end up only needing about 17 gallons per minute here. So that's significantly different. So this is the magic number that, you know, if I've got a solid acre of production, this is what I need. So in order for my drip irrigation to work correctly. And if you don't have it, that's where you start looking at backup plans and figuring out other ways to work things out. All right, welcome back. So, all right, you've all had a chance to stretch a little bit, take a deep breath, get some oxygen in your lungs. So we'll go through this list a little bit quickly. So this last slide I was sharing with folks is, there's somebody asked me earlier, how do you figure out how much drip tape or plastic you need for a solid acre or for an acre? You just know that and 1 acre has 43,560 square feet. You divide that by whatever the row spacing is, whatever in feet. So, and that's going to give you the number of how many linear feet of tape or how much linear feet of plastic you actually need per acre. Similar kind of math that you use to figure out the gallons per minute that you actually need to irrigate a particular acre. This is on the handout, so you can look through it. So, all right. Fertigation, which has already been mentioned. Fortunately, a lot of things I'm going to mention to you, I can sort of bypass because other speakers have already mentioned this. Fertigation is injecting fertilizer material through the irrigation system, whether it's overhead or it's drip irrigation. But obviously, I'm going to talk more about drip irrigation. Uniformity. If your system is set up correctly, so you will put out the same amount of fertilizer from one side of the field to the other 10 acres away. So that's the key of having it set up correctly. It's very high fertilizer and water use efficiency, so you do a whole lot better when you're actually doing this. The scheduling, when you do it, and the actual amount is going to differ by the crop and the age of the crop. And there's actually charts and tables out there that you can follow saying, all right, in the first 2 weeks, I need to put out this much nitrogen, this much potassium per day. So you can actually go through, and I'll show you what that looks like in a second. Most of the fertilizers you're typically using, whether it's organic or inorganic production, you're primarily putting out nitrogen potassium for field production. All right, you're primarily putting out nitrogen potassium, unless of course you're growing greenhouse tomatoes, then you're putting everything out the plant needs because you're growing it in artificial media. So, or media that doesn't have any nutrients. So it's primarily calcium, potassium nitrate. There are a lot of organic options, which I'll show you. This should be based on your soil tests. So, and then as Dr. Snyder said earlier, and our last speaker, you also would do a nutrient analysis, a leaf tissue analysis periodically through the season to see exactly where you're at. And I'll talk more about that in a second. When do you inject? When do you start putting fertilizer out? Start putting it out within 1 week of transplanting or within 1 week of seedling emergence. So once the seeds have come up and growing, because before that point, they're not going to need any nutrients. So that's a good number to work with. You can do it plus or minus a couple of days. Continue through harvest. Growers often, especially commercial tomato growers in the field, they stop fertilizing after a certain point. But really, if you want to get that final hand up to a reasonably good size, you really need to continue fertigation through that final harvest. So some growers have, it's the kind of thing, if you try it, you'll probably find out that it actually does work quite well. But a lot of times you get towards the end of the season, you go, man, I just cannot put any more nitrogen down on this crop. I just don't want to do it anymore. So, but what will happen is you don't end up harvesting that last hand. So you just don't get size. Leaf tissue analysis is done for looking at the development of the crop. And of course, as the other speaker said, you've got to use soluble fertilizers. So for injection, so you'll never get a unsoluble fertilizer into water, taking some 1010, putting it in a bucket. The standard field grade commercial fertilizer will not dissolve. So I've seen people try to make do, and it really makes a horrible mess. All right, when do you inject? When do you start your injection system? You start it after the system is fully pressurized. So because before that, if the system is not fully pressurized, you're going to get uneven fertilizer distribution through the system. You don't want that. So a lot of times, all these drip irrigation systems work at low PSI, 10 to 12 PSI typically max. And it takes time for that pressure to begin to develop to develop in the drip irrigation system. So changes in water pressure, like a pump cycling off and on, that can cause fluctuations. That can be problematic. Usually it's not a major problem, but if you're trying to go like using your house well that's set up to irrigate, for your use in the house, a lot of times those are really not well suited to these ag situations because the way the pump turns off and on. So you may not have enough pressure or enough flow rate. So you really have to think in terms of commercial production when it comes to irrigation. You try to inject towards the end of the cycle. You sit there and say, all right, I need to run my drip system 3 to 4 hours every day, 7 days a week in order to get that 1 inch of water out at the end of the week. So most crops, we want to get at least 1 inch of water out every week. So you have to operate every day. You're going to turn it on for 3 or 4 hours. So, and say you've got a volume of fertilizer, and I'll talk about injection or the materials in a second. But you need to figure out how long it takes you to put that volume of fertilizer through the system. Some systems are quick, some are slow, and I'll show you what some of those look like, but you try to inject towards the end of your irrigation event. I'm going to operate my irrigation for 4 hours. It takes me 3 hours to actually, or 30 minutes to get the fertilizer actually out. So at 3-hour mark, I'm going to inject my fertilizer. It's going to take 30 minutes for it to run through and get it all out. Then you want it to run for another 15 to 20 minutes to clear the lines out, to get all the fertilizer you just put in out and towards the plants. If you inject at the front end, what you're going to do is, this is a dye that was used in the sandy soil, just to show the wetted front, the way the fertilizer actually spreads out from the drip tape. If you inject at the beginning, you're going to push all that fertilizer away from the plant mass, so away from the roots where you want it to go. So the most efficient use is always trying to inject towards the end of whatever your irrigation event is, regardless of how long you're going to run it. Most of the common materials that we use out there, like I said, for nitrogen, are going to be ammonium nitrate, although that's getting a little harder to find. So potassium, calcium nitrate are probably the two most common. And there's also a number of solution materials out there that you can buy pre-mixed already. It's either pre-mixed in water, or it's a pack, like a Tide pack kind of thing you throw into a bucket that's already got fertilizer, just a bigger version of it. For potassium, it's almost always potassium nitrate, potassium sulfate, or potassium chloride, depending on your situation. So the plant doesn't care where it comes from. It can come from inorganic fertilizer or an organic. The plant cannot make a distinction between where it came from. What's key is that it's there, regardless of how you actually put it out. All right, dry soluble fertilizers. All right, so that's what Dr. Snyder's talked about. When you buy these pre-mixed materials. So they're pre-mixed. It's water soluble. You put it in water, it dissolves. So there is one way to calculate how much you used based on whatever you're trying to get out, versus buying these pre-mixed materials. With the pre-mixed materials, the mathematics becomes really complicated and unpleasant. So you have to consider the weight of the water, and there's several things you've got to do. So what some smart people in Clemson did was they came up with a calculator. So you can log onto the site. So put in, I'm using a 303 fertilizer, the amount that you want to put out, and it'll spit out a number at the end saying this is how much of the product you need to inject to get those parts per million of nitrogen, or that many pounds per acre out there. So it's really clever. There's other calculators out there, but this is, honestly, I found this one to be remarkably user-friendly. It's simple, it makes sense. You input whatever the numbers are for the analysis of the fertilizer, and you're going to get a calculation at the end of it. So don't try to figure that out based on yourself, because it's really easy to make a mistake. That's kind of the math I screw up on a regular basis, so I've got to go backwards and make sure I don't screw that up. So anyway, all right, organic materials, obviously whatever you use for organic production, if you're certified organic, it's got to be cleared with OMRI, the Organic Materials Review Institute. So whatever you use, it's got to be listed on their website. Sodium nitrate is still labeled for use on organics. This is a mined product, but it can only account for 20% of your total nitrogen needs right now. That was supposed to change many years ago, but they've sort of stuck to it to use it. Sodium nitrate is horribly expensive. You're shipping rock to yourself. So, and shipping, it's just one of those products is you're not going to find it at your local stores here, so you've got to ship it to yourself. Obviously, anything's got to be water soluble. Most of the nitrogen compounds that are like this, they're very low in nitrogen, so you've got to use a lot of it. And unfortunately, it's a lot of water, and that's not a complaint. That's just simply the nature of the beast. So most of them are less than 0.1% nitrogen, maybe up to 4% are the common ones. You can get higher numbers when you start getting products that are made from bat guano, hydrolyzed fish. That's where they just take Asian carp and they go through a process where they basically stick it in a big blender and process the stuff and make an emulsion. It smells horrible. So if you want to really scare people away, use that stuff. It is incredibly bad. There's also a trout material that smells awful, but it's got high nitrogen. So shelf life has been an issue with some of these products over time, but honestly now they've really come up with good products that will typically have a date stamped on it. Some of these products have to be shaken, to make sure that they're actually in suspension really well before you inject it. They're expensive. When you look at the per unit nitrogen costs, they can be almost 20 to 1 ratio. So $20 per pound of nitrogen for some of these organic products compared to inorganic materials. So, and I'm not saying it's good or bad. That's just simply the reality. So fertilizer costs right now are high regardless of what you're doing. So, and unfortunately with organics, they're even higher. Injectors, you've probably all seen these types of injectors. The volumetric proportioning is the most common, Dosematic, Dosatron. These are pretty pricey for basic ones, $300 or $400. So for the absolute bare bones, but most of them on average are probably more in the $500 to $600 range. These Venturi type Mozzie injectors, you may have heard the name. This is a small one. This is about $20. You could do 1/4 of an acre with this at a time. Obviously, if you only have an acre, that's not a bad deal. But if you got 10, you're going to be spending an awful lot of time trying to get fertilizer out. That's another proportioning injector. That one over there is very much like these. You've probably seen these around. These are common. They're not very precise, but because basically you take a plug of fertilizer, you dump it into the canister, and it goes out. You can adjust it a little bit there's usually a valve on here to adjust the rate of water that goes into the tank, but they're not very precise. They'll get the job done. They're a cheap way to get involved with it. So if you've got a small area, probably one of the older technologies, but you can still find them, are positive displacement pumps. So these are piston pumps, and they're powered, and they take out X amount of 1 gallon of fertilizer will inject into the stream of irrigation. They're pricey, but they're very precise, like the Dosatrons and Dosmatics. The Mozzie is probably the most common one out there. That's a brand name. It's like saying Xerox, but it's a Venturi device. So, and there's nothing magic about these. This is the Venturi device here in your irrigation. All it's doing is it's water that gets squeezed through a small volume, so into a small aperture. And the magic of that is that when you do that, you create a suction, so material gets sucked up into the Mozzie. So it's a really clever way to do it. The one issue you run into Mozzies, or sometimes they're going to have metal fittings in them, or they're brass. Brass wears out, especially with some of these really acidic solutions we use, so they lose their accuracy over time. So if you're going to get one, really get a plastic one that's made out of, the more resistant plastics. These basic Mozzies, they start about $75 to $80. But they're really a good way to get into this. And I'll show you how all this sort of plumbs together. This is a typical setup, what you're seeing here. So if I'm using a below ground water source and I've got minimal filtration, water from the well is going up through here. This is a check valve. So anybody who's probably ever done plumbing in their house, all a check valve does is it makes sure water does not flow backwards into the system. So you don't want, I have seen people with blue wells, because they did not have a check valve on their system. So you just don't want to contaminate the water source. And some municipalities demand these. They have to be on there. Sometimes you have to have double check valves. This is a pressure reducer. This particular one, sort of a cool little unit. It's adjustable. You can change the pressure. A lot of times systems coming out of a well are 70 to 80 psi, and I said that drip irrigation works at 10 to 12. So this is a way of sort of stepping it down slowly going through the system. But the next thing is you've got this. This is a disc filter. There's discs, screen filters. These are the basic bare bones that are used typically just to get sand particles or silt particles out of your irrigation stream. So very minor, very small, but these are getting very expensive, unfortunately. The little tiny ones that work on 3/4 inch line are $20. This one, unfortunately, is probably closer to 200 now. So but it's working on a 2-inch line. The next thing you've got is, here's the Mozzie. All right, this is the main flow of the water going this way. There is a pressure valve there, a gauge there, one there. There's a gate valve in the center. So in order to get the Mozzie to work correctly, you need to be able to see with the pressure going in and the pressure going out. You clamp down on this valve until you get about a 10% difference between the high side and the low side. Once you get to that 10% point, it's going to start pulling up material into the injector. So it takes having those gauges on there really takes the guesswork out. You know you're doing it correctly, and honestly, they're cheap. $20 will buy one of these things. So this bypass, it just connects it in the water. There's another screen filter here because sometimes if you've ever dissolved Miracle-Gro in water, there's always stuff left that doesn't dissolve. So this pulls all those little particles out. Then of course it goes out to the field. So this is the basic setup. If you were doing an above ground water source, a lake, This would be different. So you would have probably sand media filters here in line that would clean up the water to get it to the point where it's actually usable for irrigation. And obviously the difference between $180 and $700. So it's a big difference if you have media filters. The amount that you actually inject varies depending on what crop you're growing. Inject either based on plant growth or you're injecting based on the calendar. Based on plant growth is you start with small amount of fertilizer and you've been increasing it over time based on the stage of the crop development. The other way is injecting a even distribution. So I have to put out 150 units of nitrogen to my crop. I have a crop like tomatoes that's 15 to 16 weeks for a 5-week-old transplant, and I'm going to put this amount of nitrogen out per day, or however you decide to distribute it. When you're thinking about what you're going to put out and how you're going to put out on more clayey soils, you can inject less frequently if you want to because they have better water holding capacity and nutrient holding capacity. On a sandy soil, you probably have to do it more frequently. So if I'm a grower in Florida or southern part of Georgia, I'm injecting nitrogen every day because of how sandy my soils are. It's almost like a hydroponic situation. So it's that sandy. So if I'm in the mountains in North Carolina where we've got heavy clay soils, I can inject once or twice a week, and that's good. So because of the quality of the soil. So you all understand that? So, all right. With the differing rate following the plant growth curve, we have excellent research for almost all the major crops that we grow, including tomatoes, peppers, watermelons, the melons, cucumbers, okra, squash. So it's an actual printed document. You'll look at it, and I'll show you what one looks like. So they're the same. It shouldn't really matter where you're at in the country or what they look like. So I know that sounds odd, but there's obviously some regional difference and things like that with which you might start with, but these have been worked out through research, so we find that they really have good application regardless where you happen to be at. All right, if I'm using the same rate over time, this is just to give you an example, soil test. I'm going to put out 100% of all the phosphorus, magnesium, calcium, lime, whatever else the soil test requires. Pre-plant, I'm going to put out a portion of my nitrogen and potassium. So, sort of depending on what I'm doing, and what's available. Then it's going to leave a portion of NK to put out. So I start with 200 pounds of nitrogen so that I need to put out for a crop. The rates that you use typically for plasticulture should be higher. In Alabama, the recommendation is 120 units of nitrogen for bare ground. We don't even recommend growing bare ground anymore because the production is so much better on plastic. So that's why this number is a lot higher. So 200 pounds nitrogen you're putting out total. You put out 50 pounds of nitrogen pre-plant. So that equates to 50 pounds. So that leaves about 150 that needs to go out for the crop. If I'm just doing even distribution, 5-week-old plants, 14-week season, that's about 10.7 pounds of nitrogen per acre per week, or 1.5. So it's really easy to figure this out. But again, you tend to put out way more fertilizer than you need when the plants are small and not enough when the plants get larger. The better option is using one of these, the fertigation table. So you should be able to Google on these things and you can find them. They're in the production handbooks that you find. What's the book here is the Midwest, the Midwest Vegetable Production Guide? Yeah, so it's free, right, if you download it?
From Purdue, yeah.
From Purdue, yeah. So it also includes Missouri in that. And in there, if you open up, you will find these schedules. So for crops, so you can follow through that. So you can see this is just a typical one. Same example I showed you before, 50 pounds out pre-plant. And then basically from day 0 to day 14, I put out this much. And then I begin increasing my rate of nitrogen as the season progresses. So it's a logical way of doing it. So we've got these made out for almost all the major crops that are out there. Dr. Snyder and others have already talked about leaf tissue sampling. This is how you tweak your system. This is how you figure out, all right, am I at the 14-day schedule, or is my plants are progressing a little bit more quickly, and maybe I need to start putting out more nitrogen more quickly to my crop so I'm keeping up with the demand the crop's got. Some seasons are hotter, some are colder. You may drag this out a little bit and not put out more. You may get to day 20 and you're still putting out the low rated nitrogen. So that leaf tissue sampling is invaluable to figure out what made it into the plant. I like to combine these with soil testing because that way you know what's made it in the soil, then you know what made it in the plant, and you can figure out some corrective action if there's a major issue out there. Or it's going to tell you, yeah, you're doing just what you need to do. Keep doing what you're doing. But these leaf tissue samples, we've got values for tomatoes going from the first flower cluster of tomatoes all the way up to the 6. So we know exactly how much N, P, K, calcium, magnesium, boron, etc. should be in the crop at that particular stage of development. So it's a really nice way to, frankly, just check your handiwork. You've already spent, in tomatoes, if I'm growing 1 acre of tomato, typically pre-harvest costs are going to be someplace in the $5,500 to $6,000, and that's before I harvest anything. You've already got a lot invested in the crop. So what's a leaf tissue sample cost here to get done? 20 bucks?
Oh, it's about $20.
Oh, yeah, 20 bucks. It's going to tell you exactly what's in the crop, though. It is invaluable. So it's a good investment. Look at it that way. It's just simply insurance for yourself, because we all, as Dr. Snyder said earlier, we're worriers. We're growing these crops. We need to know what's going on. So what better way than to actually reveal what's in the crop and make sure you're where you need to be for that crop. So, because you don't want to get to the end of the season going, what happened? You know, that is, you know, it's disheartening, and you know it's pretty discouraging. So, all right. Dr. Snyder already mentioned this, the diagnostic leaf that you take off the tomato. Does anybody know what deficiency this is? This is on the top of this is new growth coming out of the tomatoes. Has anybody ever seen this before? It's really cool looking. Lime-colored plant. It's not a variegated plant, although you can find those in tomatoes sometimes. This is iron deficiency. Yep, iron deficiency. This shows up late season when you use a lot of crop protectants that have a lot of manganese. So what happens is there's competition, the plant gets lots of manganese, and it interferes with iron uptake. So this is not a deficiency, it's something that's actually induced by crop protectants, sort of a unique case, but it's really common to see in the panhandle of Florida and through Florida, so just one of those unusual things. This is where this is how you get the information. So you've got a good, strong cooperative extension system here. The information that's in your packet, who to call, what website to go to figure it out. So, and I know the agents are here and obviously can help you figure that out. Typically, just sort of wrapping up, you figure for 1 acre of plastic, 5 or 6 foot spacing between the rows, you're going to spend someplace between $350 to $700 an acre just for the plastic culture materials, for the plastic mulch, for the drip irrigation settings, fittings, so etc. So it's not inexpensive, but honestly, when you look at the potential of doubling your yields or possibly even quadrupling your yields, increasing the quality of what you're producing, this really makes a lot of sense. And honestly, any mulch helps. You know, I don't care what crop you're growing, any mulch can help. Black plastic in this particular case will heat the soil up. That's why the plant grows more quickly. That's why it typically develops and gets bigger more rapidly, and you get earlier yields. So you've got to weigh that, what your expectations are versus what you're putting out there. So and this is where you also start thinking about double cropping. If I can use my plastic twice, that's going to spread that initial cost over 2 crops, and that just starts to make a lot of sense for you. So does it help? Will it make a difference? So, you know, those are the kind of things you sort of have to think about a little bit. All right, switch gears just a little bit. So we've got till, I'm sorry, 5:30, right? 6 o'clock? I'll go to 7 if you want. So what do you guys want? So I just want to talk a little bit about post-harvest handling. Obviously, this is switching gears a little bit. So many times growers get to the end of their season, and they're just like, I just don't want to look at another tomato. That is just not that's not the attitude to have. They've always got to be handled like eggs. This picture is from Florida, and I'm not making fun of Florida, but I was looking at the field going, you see that height drop they've got? So you wonder why those tomatoes look and taste the way they do when you actually get them in the stores. These are the ones that are going to be cellophane wrapped. These are going to be mature green. So, you know, anything with color, which is interesting, all that stuff with color gets trashed. You will go outside and the packing house, there'll just be mountains of ripe tomatoes out there that just get discarded because they don't fit into the mature green industry. So don't do this. This is never a good thing to do. So handle them like eggs. Get them out of the sunshine. Even if you have to just take your pickup truck, park it under a tree just to get some shade, you've got to remember that tomato, pepper, whatever you're growing, it's alive. It's respiring. Once you disconnect it from the plant, it's going to be depending on its own water within it to keep itself cool and to maintain its processes. That's why we always talk about getting it out of the sun as quickly as you possibly can. Never, ever, ever ice tomatoes. Never put them into an ice bath. That is bad. So that is a great way to get disease-causing organisms actually into the fruit. Think of it like a sponge. You put this really hot fruit in really cold water, and it's just going to suck up whatever happens to be around it. If you do, like these tomatoes that are grown on large scale like this, they flume them, and it'll smell like a pool because they're usually using a chlorine kind of product in order to disinfest the outside of the tomato fruit to clean it, but the water is at pulp temperature. Whatever the temperature of that tomato is, that's the tomato of the water they're using to clean the fruit off. So if it's 93 degrees, that water is 93 degrees. But for the most part, most of us are not growing that volume of tomatoes that we're worrying about that. But so never, ever, ever ice them. Don't put them in the refrigerator, so at all. Pre-cooling, you've ever heard the term, it's removing field heat. And in tomatoes, we typically recommend two types of cooling. A lot of you, when you're a smaller grower, you're typically dealing with a common cooler that has everything in it. So you sit there going, all right, what temperature do I put it at? If I happen to be growing greens, lettuce, mustard greens, something like that, salad greens, those can be stored down to 32 degrees. Tomatoes should never go below 55. So what temperature do you put it at? That's always the question. So, and unfortunately in this case, you sort of have to look at the crop that has the most cold sensitivity. So you would probably try to put it around 55 degrees. But the other crop's going to suffer. It's going to lose water. It's going to desiccate and things. It's nice to have two storage facilities when you can do it. There's some really cool technology out there. If you Google, have you ever seen a CoolBot? Have you heard that term? Google on CoolBot. It is a controller that will turn an air conditioner into a cooler for you. It's a $300 little item. You can put it into an insulated truck, like a little trailer that you pull, or you can get a container. And it's a really rapid way and cheap way, frankly, to get into refrigeration. It's nice if you can have two coolers, ideally, one with a low temperature, one with a high temperature. Never store tomatoes below 55 degrees. Just stamp that on your forehead and remember it. So you can store them at lower temperatures when they're fully red ripe, but all that affects the taste, and it affects greatly the firmness and the quality of the fruit. So all that is basically a face-saving measure that's going to maintain the tomato to make it look the same, for you to simply extend your marketing window a little bit. But ideally, never below 55 to 60 degrees. All right. Last thing I want to spend just a few minutes on is, and a lot of the speakers have already alluded to it, and Dr. Snyder talked about taste, talked about mature green tomatoes, so in the stage at which you harvest, so I'm not going to go back over that. You already know that at this point. A lot of times with varieties, how do you figure out when to harvest it? It is very common, especially with heirlooms, to pick them too early. So sometimes we wait too late. Or the tomato itself, there are some heirlooms, and I'm not poking fun at heirlooms, but there are some heirlooms that are simply just awful tomatoes. They are just awful. The taste, the texture, they're mealy. And it's not something you've done, it's just the variety. So you really need to understand the varieties you're growing. Never jump into it. Grow a couple plants of X, try it out, see what it looks like under your management style to see if it's really suited for your particular situation. Don't handle the fruit all the same way. So you're growing all this, you may be growing a multitude of different types of tomato fruits. They all have a unique stage at which they are peak ripeness. So that word vine ripe, it's actually got a very broad definition, and Dr. Snyder showed you some pictures of it. But the USDA's definition of vine ripe is everything basically from breaker stage on up. So you can use the official term vine ripe, and you can harvest it over a large stage. But obviously for a local production, you want it as ripe and mature as you can get it, because that's when it's going to have the best sugar and acid content and all those other things that make up flavor in the tomato. Flavor in the tomato is actually, how do we maintain taste? Obviously, one of the ways we do that is we make sure we harvest when we're supposed to. And every crop is a little different. Even from year to year, the same variety, you may notice a little bit of differences. And it's the environment. The environment obviously affects the quality of what you're growing. How do we really balance taste and shelf life? That's sort of the key of what I was thinking about with this. Maturity in the tomato refers to its ripeness, basically how mature it is. When it's mature green, that also means you can pick the tomato and it will mature on its own, disconnected from the plant. Immature green will not do that. It'll still be green. They don't end up developing that nice locular gel that's inside of it and all those aromatic compounds that affect your senses when you're actually eating these things. when it comes down to fruit quality and flavor, color is not always the best indicator. Like if you're growing a yellow fruit, if you're growing a pink fruit, if you're growing a striped fruit, what's the ideal point? How can you figure that as a grower to really figure out, have I reached the point where the quality is the best that I can sell it to people? So can I harvest this today and sell it Friday? You know, can it sit there for 5 or 6 days, either outside in the shed or in a cooler? You know, that's the kind of things you sort of trial and error for some of these varieties. All these things affect tomato quality. All these things that are written up here. The size, the shape, the color, its condition. Obviously, you don't want to have any decay or anything like that. Its texture. Some tomatoes have awful texture. It's just there are some old heirlooms that people swear by these things, sell them for a bunch, and they're just awful to me. I mean, I'd like to like them, you know, and there's some commercial varieties like that too. Commercial varieties, like we talk about Celebrity, everyone's probably grown, that was a mainstay commercial variety in the 80s. That was the industry standard for commercial production. Now it's a homegrown homeowner variety because people found it tasted okay. It was actually pretty decent as a tomato goes. It's not technically an heirloom. Maybe, you know, in another 20 years it'll become an heirloom, and it's also a hybrid. A lot of heirlooms tend to be open pollinated varieties that we're growing. Composition, we always talk about sugars, acids. What becomes important actually is the ratio of those two things. And then the fancy term I've got there, aromatic volatiles. These are the chemicals that you smell that you interpret as, you know, your smell will help you taste. If you really want to taste something in an unusual way, hold your nose and don't breathe and try to taste something. You really can't do it. It's just your problem is, you know, your nose and your tongue, everything is designed to work together in concert. But if you close one off, you can really affect the taste. So for a person, and of course vitamins. So all these factors change as a fruit ripens and matures. All of them. So you've got to try to pick that fine point of when is the optimal time for this variety to be picked. All right. You all have seen charts like this. All of you have seen these charts. For example, the speaker earlier was talking about varieties, and we talk about the yellows, that they're mild. They have high sugar, low acidity. Well, in a lot of cases, it's actually not true. So these are really misnomers. This is not accurate labeling, you know, to actually go through. These are really based on personal perceptions of these things. How do you really measure that? How do you measure sweetness in a tomato? How do you measure its acidity? You can actually do it as a grower. Are any of you fruit growers or honeybee keepers? Use a refractometer for your honey to look at the sweetness? You can use refractometers for tomatoes, for fruit. If you know, and there's actually certain stages you can look at to figure out, am I at 5 minutes? There's actually points in the production cycle that you can figure out that are optimized. Dr. Snyder's already showed this, so I'm not going to talk about this. So I'll sort of skip through this one. All right. We talk a lot about carotenoids, lycopene, beta-carotene, xanthophylls. The carotenoids, these are all carotenoids. These are all chemicals that the tomato produces during its production cycle. So, and they change. So depending on the particular variety, we may have various combinations of these things. So, but the key thing is people say, I can taste that color. You can't. Lycopenes, beta-carotene, xanthophylls have no taste, or at least human palates can't interpret them. So it's a blank. So if you were to eat something that just was xanthophil, it wouldn't taste like anything to you. So, but they do affect some other compounds that get produced from these things, like vitamin A and some other things. But humans lack the receptors for these things. So you really can't taste the color. There are other things that produce color. You know, because we've got fruit that are different colored, like these. Like, you know, the blacker fruits and things, the blues, purples, and blacks. These are all produced from another set of chemicals called anthocyanins. These are the same chemicals that are in the plants, the flowers that we grow. So the same blue is from the same anthocyanin that produces here, purples, blacks. Flavonoids do all kinds of nice things, and one of the reasons we want to consume them is they're supposed to help us help fight free radicals in our system and have all kinds of health benefits. They don't really contribute to taste either. However, very high concentrations, like in fruit like this that are really black or dark purple, you can get a little bit of a bitter, astringent taste from a high concentration of flavonoids. Just so that's something like you may see that on Jeopardy tonight, so it might be a question. You'll know the answer now. The reason I'm sort of showing you this way too complicated graph is. So this is based on the tomato stages of maturity, going from green all the way to red. And what you find is things change. So people are always saying, well, that's a really sweet tomato or that's a really acidic tomato. But what you find is, looking at these lines, this is showing you the color changes, all right, that happen in a mature fruit as a fruit matures. This is showing you things that decrease as a fruit matures. So color increases as a fruit matures, which you all probably attest to that. The aroma, if you cut an immature fruit, it really doesn't have much of a smell to it. So, but boy, when they start getting mature, the smells and those aromatic compounds really start coming out. The flavor begins changing, but again, flavor is complicated. The sugars increase. So, all right, the acidity within the fruit down here, the acidity actually decreases. And this is true for all tomato fruit. So when someone says this is a really acid tomato, when it's mature, it's probably not. It's just got to do with the complicated ingredients that actually make up flavor. So, because if you were actually measuring acidity and flavor, you can measure sugars in a fruit. And this is a refractometer, and this thing measures something called soluble solids. You take a little bit of the locular gel in the tomato, you put it on that refractometer, and it gives you a number. So, and that number, is an absolute number. That's the relative sweetness of the fruit. You can also measure the acidity of the fruit. A little more complicated for a grower, but you can actually buy a kit where you can actually measure it's called the titratable acidity. So you can actually look, and what you do is if you follow these fruit as they mature, you would see the acidity begins decreasing. So because what's happening is these compounds are getting converted into all those things that make the tomato flavorful, the gels, those polymers within there, all this nice gel. So, and the acidity begins decreasing. Conversely, the sugars begin increasing in the fruit. So as it ripens, so the sugar-acid ratio actually increases over time. Somebody a couple years ago did a study. They just looked at all these commercial tomato fruits. All right, these are all commercial varieties, and what they did was they measured the sugars, and then they measured the acids. And what they found was, on average, don't worry about the alphabet soup that you see here. So it's just really confusing. But basically, what you find is the relative amount of sugars. The soluble solids were basically the same. It didn't matter what variety you're looking at. They all ended up being about 4.5-ish. So, but they also found was the acidity begins decreasing quite significantly. So, and then they calculate the ratios. But this tells me that when you look at the chart showing you, a yellow tomato is supposed to have more sugar, it's probably not accurate. So, this is sort of the conclusions, some from some studies, and what they found was things like grapes and cherries tend to be sweeter. So, and they were actually producing the same amount of sugar, it's just they were concentrated in a smaller volume. Sort of interesting. So it didn't really matter what fruit, it was the same amount, it just was concentrated. And with grape tomatoes, what's interesting is grape tomatoes have more fructose than they do glucose, and fructose on a human tongue is sweeter. So a higher amount of fructose in grape tomatoes means it tastes sweeter to me. So you see the grape tomatoes out there. The rest of these, it's pretty much just glucose that you're typically dealing with, which is table sugar. So, but what you find is it tends to be fairly stable across varieties. So this sugar-acid ratios that we typically see, it's a good predictor of when a fruit's ready because you're going to have higher sugar-to-acid ratios. Once the tomato gets in that 4.2, 4.5 range, it's probably mature and it's probably got as much sugar as it ever will have. The acidity is going to decrease. So having a low acid tomato, it's really not the acids you're dealing with, it's all those things that make up flavor compounds in that fruit, the aromatic compounds that you're smelling. So as a fruit develops, sugar-acid ratios increase. You end up with typically sugars in that 4 to 6% range, acids. These aromatic volatiles, so a good example of an aromatic volatile is gasoline. So you smell it, when it's open because it's so volatile. So that's really a major flavor component, and that almost predisposes you to tasting, having an interpretation of what it's going to taste like before you even taste it. So it's almost like anticipation. So I can measure sugars, I can measure acid, so I know they're going to affect the relative maturity and the sweetness of the fruit. So sugar-acid ratios increase as the fruit ripens. color may not be the best indicator of flavor, but it certainly helps to determine maturity. Each variety or cultivar is unique. So, and it could be even unique from year to year, so it's really going to be based on your personal experiences. If you can measure things like the acidity of these fruit, or the refractometers are easy. You can go to Amazon now, you could buy one for 25 bucks. They are really useful. So just to measure these things, just to look at these things, you're going to see that when that green fruit's coming out, the little bit of gel that's produced, it'll be like 2% when it's first starting to develop. Then it starts and doubles and it gets to that 4.5 to 5%. So it's just a useful tool, but you know, I think it's helpful being growers that you know some of these things, so that flavor's complicated. And honestly, and then, you know, and it's personal perception of what you actually like, because you will taste some tomato varieties that are simply awful. You know, I mean, it's remarkable. So I grew up in New Jersey. Everyone was always raving about Jersey tomatoes. So if you're on the Eastern Seaboard, you'll hear that kind of a lot. How about here? Where's the best tomatoes in Missouri come from? Is there a place?
I don't think anybody that I know is like, I know the best way.
Yeah, so I think that, obviously, I think that's a marketing opportunity for you. So maybe you need to have some kind of marketing effort to really push Missouri tomatoes, because they are just as good. You know, figure out the best time to pick these things, because that's going to be your best friend as a grower, knowing when to pick, knowing the best time to pick, looking for some of these things you can measure, like the sweetness of the fruit, or a little more complicated to do the acidity. So, but you can do it. You can measure these things and you can look, and it'll give you information. So the more information you have as a grower, I think that's useful. Some of the things are so subjective, like feel and taste and touch and things like that. It's nice if you can make things a little bit more objective to really figure it out. Here's a new variety I'd never grown before. Let me just, you know, waste a few fruit, do some testing, see what it's like, and then realize that, you know, wow, that really does change over time. A little bit riper, that really stands up, but the shorter the, but you decrease shelf life. The more mature fruit gets, the quicker you need to sell it. So maybe you need to leave them on the vine longer. That's going to affect labor situation. You know, I sit there, I have labor on Mondays and Fridays. Those are the days I have labor. So sometimes you're simply subject to when you've got hands. So, you know, so there's a lot of things that go into this. So, but obviously if you have some of this foreknowledge and you're able to sort of parse some of these things out, you may be able to help sort of narrow things down a little bit and figure out really when's the best time to do these things. Overall in the tomato, there's like 15 or 20 volatile compounds that actually affect taste, or not taste, or the smell of what these things, and taste to some degree, certainly. So, and most of these tend to be precursors for a lot of other compounds, and they change, they fluctuate. If I stick this thing in the refrigerator, you are really going to affect these volatiles that are formed. You ever do that, stick a ripe tomato in a refrigerator for a day, come back and smell it. It's going to have the smell's going to be more minimized because you've affected all the things that actually are occurring within that fruit. When someone asks me how's the best way to really figure out taste, I tell them, I said, take some data. Try to take some things that are a little bit objective and taste. So, when I worked for a tomato breeder going through graduate school, and I wasn't a big tomato fan at first. It was always one of those things, I got to eat it, because it's on my plate. But I learned that I was actually more objective when I tasted these things because I was never a big fan of it. One of the best breeders works at a breeding company that develops a lot of, muskmelons, the cantaloupe variety. So he absolutely hates the taste of these things, and but he's really good at parsing the taste because he's so adverse to trying these things. So it's really funny to watch him do it because he almost gets sick tasting it because he dislikes them that much. But he's an excellent breeder. He developed Athena, so that you've all probably had. So at some point, so it's complicated. Don't rely on those charts that you might see. That was the last one. And I think it's 5:30, so I believe.
Yeah, perfect.
So,
thank you very much,
sure.
Joe. Are there any questions for Joe? Yep, here we go. Let's have it.
So, measuring sugar is pretty easy with the refractometer. You did mention that measuring acidity. You kept referencing
titratable acidity.
Titratable acidity. Not to go back to old chemistry classes where you had phenylalanine and, watch the changes in the color. Is there anything wrong with just getting a simple digital pH meter? Does that accurately judge the acidity
No.
for flavor? Okay.
No,
No.
The titrator, it's involved. It has a pH meter, but it goes through a little bit of processing to get it into a form that you can really measure the pH accurately. That's the key. There's got to be the tissue has to be macerated, to get a nice. You can't. It could be. It's a little more complicated. It's like one or two more steps involved in it, but it's easy. It doesn't involve. It's basically somebody could hand you the instructions, say do A, B, C, and then you're done. You've got a good measurement of it. So.
Is there a resource for a grower to measure that themselves?
There's actually several companies that make kits to measure titratable acidity. So if you Google on that, there's a company out of the Carolinas that makes that's the one I'd use. It's got a pH meter. It's got something looks like a garlic press and a few other little things in there. But basically it's a self-contained kit that you could do that with. So it's like I said, it's a little more cumbersome, but it gives you information. So frankly,
okay, thank you.
With tissue analysis, so it seems like I'm working with more folks that are more interested in foliar feeding. I guess, physiologically, do some micronutrients work better through root uptake versus foliar uptake, or?
Yes and no. Basically when it comes to everyone loves putting a little fertilizer in and spraying it on. With N, P, K, calcium for the most part, magnesium, you really can't get enough to physically go through the plant's leaves to actually make a difference for the plant. You're wasting your money. It's micronutrients where it's important. But, magnesium, you can get some uptake through the leaves. But honestly, the roots are designed for uptake. 99.9% of all the nutrients come up through the roots, with the exception of sulfur. Sulfur, you can get SO2 that comes in through the stomates. So, that's really the big one in terms of the macro elements. But the small ones, if I have an iron deficiency, one application of iron chelate will clear that up. So because it's got to do with the amounts. It's parts per million versus parts per billion. Such a tiny, tiny amount that you actually need for the plant to complete its process. So does that make sense? So save your money on foliar feeding. Honestly, put it around the roots. You're going to be a lot more effective by drenching the roots with a gallon of, if you're going to use Mirror Acid or Miracle Grow or something like that, put it on plant roots. That's where it really needs to be. So don't spray it on. So unless it's a micronutrient issue. So, and they're expensive. Why put out something that's really not going to be that effective? You got plenty of other things you could spend your money on.
You mentioned flow rate to determine how long the drip lines are, how many drip lines you can have in an acre. Does pressure also affect how long the drip lines can be?
Pressure and flow rate are key, and they're intertwined. You really can't separate them. Most of the drip tape that you use is 5/8 of an inch diameter. You can only move so much water through that. So what happens, like with long runs, even at low pressure, you run out of water towards the end of it. So that's why most of the times you only run your drip tape 200-300 feet, unless it's a pressure compensating material that's designed for longer runs. The pressure always has to be maintained, low pressure on that. But if you've got flow rate and you've got minimum pressure, you can still do it. But it gives you more to work with when you've got high pressure. It's really nice if you have 70 PSI going into your injector. You want high pressure on the injection side to make that injector work correctly. If that pressure was down to 20, the Venturi injector will not work. So you've got to have a reasonable change between the high side and the low side. So that's where pressure really becomes important. So yeah, it's important. It's important that it's maintained. So you can definitely run into a situation. I helped set up a well using a well, and they were growing pumpkins, and they were growing about an acre. We used low flow tape, and they may have had 14 PSI coming out. So it was a tough struggle to do it. It's doable. The engineering's there to do it. It's expensive. So, but it also saved them from having to put a well in for their irrigation. So it's doable. It's all numbers. You just have to look at what's going in, what's coming out, and what you need.
Great. More questions?
Thank you for the invitation to speak here. It's always a lot of fun to see folks. I've got new people to meet, other people I've seen for several years. Hopefully, maybe you guys will do it next year. Or maybe I'll be able to drag Rick back. But thank you. So.